The best of Money Matters. The Big Story.
Welcome to The Big Story. I'm Hongbin Jeong. The release of China's new DeepSeek AI-powered chatbot app has rocked the technology industry. DeepSeek's R1 model is not only cheaper, but also competitive with top AI models like ChatGPT and Gemini. Now, this has sent shockwaves through Silicon Valley, with investors selling their tech stocks and companies like Nvidia seeing a significant drop in value. But what makes DeepSeek so special? The large language model that powers the app has reasoning capabilities that are comparable to U.S. models such as OpenAI's, but at a fraction of the cost to train and run. However, the excitement around DeepSeek has given way to scrutiny, with questions emerging about how its AI models were built and their broader impact. What impact will DeepSeek have on the AI landscape? And will its success undermine the ongoing U.S.-China tech war? And joining us today to tell us more is Kyle Rodda, who is a senior financial market analyst at Capital.com. Kyle, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
All right, Kyle, how significant is DeepSeek's development here, particularly in terms of challenging the dominance of companies like OpenAI and Nvidia?
Well, the way that I've been framing it with people and clients in particular is that it could be everything or it could be nothing. And the reason why that's the case is that there is a lot of ambiguity at the moment around some of the information that we've received from DeepSeek, but also perhaps some of the impacts that have stemmed from DeepSeek's influence subsequently that mean that it's very, very difficult to ascertain at the moment what the consequences might be for the technology and the industry, but then, obviously more pertinently for someone like myself, the financial markets. On the one hand, if we see that the claims made by DeepSeek are true, then this could have profound implications for artificial intelligence and profound implications for US tech dominance. However, if it proves to be that even slightly some of these numbers that have been provided by DeepSeek are a little bit fudged or there's more to this story, then maybe this isn't going to be much of a ripple at all. There's still a lot to know, but again, it could be incredibly consequential or it could be really just a flash in the pan.
I see. Well, DeepSeek claimed they built it using fewer and less advanced chips than U.S. tech leaders, and that they match or even surpass leading U.S. models, all at a fraction of the cost. So much so that Nvidia, the top chip maker, lost nearly $600 billion in market value. Can we trust DeepSeek's claims?
Increasingly, it looks as though that there may be more to this story, or certainly that there needs to be more divulged by DeepSeek than it has so far. Ultimately, this is a question of physics and something that we can eventually determine very easily, that whether it's able to achieve the capabilities and outcomes with its model that it claims using effectively the inputs that it has said that it has used, which is to say Nvidia chips, which are far less powerful than at least the best Nvidia chips used by US tech companies, and a number of those chips which appear to be a fraction of those being used by these major US tech companies. The significance there effectively is that if it proves to be the case that there were some hidden chips, if you will, or at least some of the costs weren't fully disclosed, the kind of magnitude or the magnitude of DeepSeek is going to be far smaller than perhaps initially feared. And again, it throws into question to what extent there'll be scalability for DeepSeek's business, whether this model can truly compete with some of these larger AI players in the United States, or whether it might be, good at a small scale and be reasonably effective for what it is, but won't really be able to challenge those major tech players. Again, if it proves to be the case that these figures and facts are absolutely true and there's nothing more to it, then again, this is a revolutionary impact on the space. However, I think increasingly it would seem that there is more to this story and that perhaps world-changing consequences of DeepSeek, which many in the investment industry were sort of tabling only a week ago, may not come to fruition.
I see. Then how has DeepSeek's more cost-effective development, raised questions about current AI infrastructures?
Well, I mean, again, if we then take the position that trust what the company has told us so far, and it is absolutely true, then the biggest consequence is the extreme overinvestment. That's what it would be, overinvestment by US artificial intelligence companies in the technology that has proven now, or would prove now, to drastically reduce the return on investment likely to see in the future. Again, this is where some of the incredulity, at least in the US tech community, comes into things, because a lot are suggesting that such significant progress could not have been made with the hardware that the company has claimed to have used. But not only that, that perhaps have created the model in the first place that has challenged some of these now legacy players in the US tech space, that they may have had to distill their model from models like OpenAI, which is effectively piggybacking off some of the technology that the United States is using, optimizing it in some respects, and again, achieving it in ways that is not really reflective of the power of the model itself and its ability to use the hardware, but to more or less kind of stand on the proverbial shoulders of the tech giants to be able to achieve what it has. So again, if it's proven to be the case that they have run this more effective model, it would be an absolute game changer. But the evidence is starting to point in the direction that there may be costs that we cannot currently see, and that the model has been achieved perhaps piggybacking a little bit on existing US technology.
I see. Well, users experimenting with DeepSeek have seen the Chinese AI chatbot reply and then, censor itself in real time. Researchers testing its capabilities have found that the answers it gives not only, spread Chinese propaganda, but also parrot disinformation campaigns that China has used to undercut its critics around the world. So, Kyle, is DeepSeek, abiding by China's strict government control and censorship rules, or will a more widespread use of DeepSeek, worldwide lead to misinformation and the spread of Chinese propaganda and, ultimately letting China control the narrative?
Well, this is where things become a little bit interesting, because this is where the political ramifications come into things, and obviously the potential impacts on the US-China trade and broader economic and political relations. It has to be said that we have seen, obviously, this kind of censorship when using DeepSeek's web platform, and obviously arguably propaganda being propagated by it as well. But users can circumnavigate that more or less by downloading the application themselves onto, for example, their desktop computer and separating it from the web application, and not getting the same censorship that you would if you were, again, just logging on the web platform to run your searches, for example. So there is ways to get around that kind of strict control. However, as we've already seen, there are these concerns about not only censorship and, the propagation of China's political narratives, but also around data storage and to what extent China may be able to access this information somewhere down the line if it wants to, and whether that is a risk to individual security or maybe even national security for players outside of China. So it's a multi-layered situation, which again can be circumnavigated by just using the product in a different way amongst consumers. However, there are very, very reasonable fears that DeepSeek is too embedded within the Chinese economy and China's tech ecosystem to be comfortable with using it.
I see. Well, then given such censorship on the app, could the US or other countries try to ban the use of DeepSeek?
Yes, or try to restrict it in other ways. And I think we're already seeing signs of that in the last few weeks. And certainly perhaps in the reaction in financial markets as well, with a lot of the, again, I'll call them legacy players, even though they're only young companies, or at least businesses like Meta are new in the space. Those companies have dusted themselves off after the sort of DeepSeek shock of early last week, really on the basis that there is expected that governments will step in to either obviously protect domestic AI capacity, but also keep out apps like DeepSeek, much like what is happening at the moment in the United States with TikTok, and first forcing it to comply with, certain rules and regulations that mitigate the risks of using the product. So already we're seeing kind of interventions being tabled, certainly by the Trump administration, and it probably goes back to this broader macro story of a multipolar world developing where certain applications will simply not be available to countries that are adversaries of your own.
Well, in the past several years, the Biden administration issued a series of increasingly strict export control rules on advanced computing chips, including a particularly onerous new rule published in the final week before the Trump administration took office. A central goal of these rules is to impede China's progress on AI. Kyle, how does DeepSeek's success diminish the leverage that the U.S. and other nations currently hold through export controls and chip-related sanctions?
Once again, it goes back to the question as to whether there is veracity behind DeepSeek's claims. If there is, then all of a sudden the power imbalance shifts significantly because China has cracked the code effectively in being able to compete with the United States at a much lower cost. However, if it proves to be the case that DeepSeek has perhaps fudged some of the numbers here, that has used more chips or maybe has found ways to access some of Nvidia's H100 chips, which of course are the sort of top of the range, then the US finds itself in a precarious and quite perhaps embarrassing position that shows that existing restrictions weren't effective, but it also proves that it can continue to exert influence over China's tech industry by finding new ways to enforce compliance and restricting access to those chips. So again, it goes down to this question of whether this is sort of all it's cracked up to be, and another reason why this could be everything or mean nothing at all. But again, if, and this is the big if for financial markets as well, that China really has cracked the code to be able to run AI far more efficiently, then this certainly bridges that power gap and certainly closes the race towards supremacy in both artificial intelligence and then more broadly technology as well.
I see. Well, then considering the current U.S. export controls targeting Chinese tech companies, how likely will DeepSeek's rise, force a shift in Washington's stance towards its relationship with China in the tech space?
Inevitably, it's going to elicit a response, and the response depends on, again, the nature of what DeepSeek has achieved here. So on the one hand, if DeepSeek is everything that it's cracked up to be, the United States will have to come up with innovative and probably more hawkish measures to be able to contain Chinese tech supremacy. These are certain things like restrictions on usage and what have you as well. Perhaps other trade sanctions as a way of trying to limit China's ability to access materials and inputs. Alternatively, if once again it proves that DeepSeek has more or less, say, lied, but maybe misled or not revealed the full truth of the situation, then all the United States has to do is focus on how to enforce compliance more effectively and continue to try and apply existing policies to put pressure on China and China's tech industry. So again, it really depends on the truth of the situation here, but I think the common thread is that either way, it's going to force a far stronger and more hawkish stance from the US on China's economy and China's tech industry.
I see. Well, Kyle, Singapore has also come under the spotlight in a US investigation into whether DeepSeek had circumvented US restrictions on advanced Nvidia chips by buying them from companies in other countries. What are the concerns from the US perspective here?
Well, fundamentally, and at the first degree, it's a problem of whether it's been able to initiate and affect policies as it was willing to do so or intending to do so. And that is to say that if these restrictions have been circumvented somehow, that is a major issue for the United States in terms of just how effective its policy has been. Secondly, and probably more importantly, there is the issue on top of that if China is accessing these chips, perhaps through improper measures or proper measures, they're doing so in such a way that threatens tech dominance or US tech dominance and is likely to, like we were talking before, inspire greater aggressiveness in order to quell that competition as it stands right now and ensure that certainly Nvidia isn't effectively acting as a conduit to power Chinese competition with US tech firms. So two-layered. One, it's ensuring that existing policies are effective, and that's almost a level of embarrassment and protection of prestige. And then on top of that, it is ensuring that those policies are doubled down upon to make sure that there aren't are no further advances being made by China's tech industry that could challenge the US tech industry.
Right. I mean, Singapore is a major hub for Nvidia chip sales. How might this scrutiny kind of impact Singapore's standing as a regional financial and manufacturing center?
Well, this is the crucial part because the way that Nvidia accounts for where sales are being directed to or attributed to is simply by which country the sales invoice is attributed to. So what it would seem to be happening here is that you mightn't even see necessarily much physical chips passing through Singapore, although I suspect that to be the case. All that is required is that a Chinese firm has some kind of business established or legal entity established in Singapore to be able to attribute its orders to that country and then subsequently move the chips onshore into China. So on the one hand, this could mean that Singapore is caught in the crosshairs of US hostility a little bit, although obviously that will be tempered by the fact that Singapore has a good relationship with the United States, and the United States wants to maintain a strong relationship with Singapore to keep leverage in the region. But the other part of that is that Nvidia will probably confront far greater scrutiny as well, because it would seem that either through, willing ignorance or perhaps simply through a lack of scrutiny, that Chinese companies are using this method to circumvent these restrictions, and therefore Nvidia will have to do more, at least in the United States' eyes, to be able to close that loophole. So it could have a big impact on Singapore more broadly as a hub, but more pertinently, I think the first line will be the impact on Nvidia and how that will increase scrutiny on Nvidia to make sure that it's complying with these rules by the United States.
Right. I mean, speaking of restrictions, the U.S. has increasingly expanded chip export restrictions to China and other countries. How effective do you think these restrictions are?
Well, it would seem that so far these restrictions haven't been effective enough, at least as far as how the US has intended for them to work. The example, like we have just given, is Singapore, how Nvidia has either willingly or unwittingly allowed for chips to enter restricted economies. But on top of that as well, there is clearly the fear that if China's tech companies are proving more effective in this kind of artificial intelligence race, the restrictions aren't tough enough or are prohibitive enough to stop that development. So from either perspective, you have to glean that the restrictions as they are now from the United States aren't doing the job effectively and will probably only have to increase as a result, obviously raising risks to both sort of economic case for the industry, but also the more broader macroeconomic implications of such trade restriction.
I see. Well, looking ahead then, Kyle, do you expect the scrutiny to further intensify? Will Trump impose, further controls on countries, including Singapore?
I think that yes is the short answer, and this will certainly intensify hostilities. One, because of the fact that there does seem to be inevitably this closing gap between the US and China in terms of the tech space. But also on top of that as well is that there seems to be once more, ineffectiveness of existing policies to be able to achieve the ends restrictions were set out to achieve in the first place. Will Singapore be caught in these restrictions? I suspect not in the short term, especially if Singapore can remain reasonably committed for trying to remain faithful to the rules imposed by the United States. However, like I said before, there might be second-order impacts on a company like Nvidia to ensure that they have got the internal controls necessary to be able to apply these sanctions properly. And, perhaps that will mean diminished trade flows going through, at least as it applies to chips in Singapore, which will have, at least at the margins, an economic impact. So, in short, yes, this will lead to an intensification. It will lead to greater trade war risks and a greater impact of those trade restrictions on economic activity, and it will also lead to greater impact on the tech industry more broadly.
I see. Well, thank you so much, Kyle, for your time and your insights today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. That was Kyle Rodda, who is a senior financial market analyst at Capital.com. This has been The Big Story with me, Hongbin Jeong.
To listen to more great interviews, download our podcasts at audio.sg or download the audio app. That's AWEDIO, audio at the App Store and Google Play.